The morning sun cast long shadows across Terminal 3 of Chicago O'Hare International Airport as hundreds of travelers moved through the bustling corridors with their rolling luggage and coffee cups. Maya Richardson walked through the crowd with the ease of someone who had done this countless times before. She wore comfortable jeans, a crisp white blouse, and a leather jacket that spoke of quality without being flashy. Her natural hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she carried only a single burgundy carry-on bag. She had just returned from 2 weeks in Paris and Barcelona, a vacation she had taken without the usual entourage that accompanied her business trips. For once, she wanted to experience flying the way her customers did, to see her airline through their eyes rather than through the polished lens of executive briefings and carefully curated tours. Maya approached Gate 47 where her flight to Atlanta was preparing to board. She checked her phone briefly, noting several missed calls from her office, but she silenced it again. This was her last hour of anonymity before returning to the demands of running one of the country's fastest-growing airlines. She pulled her boarding pass from her jacket pocket and stepped toward the gate entrance where a security officer stood reviewing documents. The officer was a white man in his mid-30s with a square jaw and an expression that seemed permanently set to suspicion. His name tag read Danny Phillips. Maya offered a polite smile as she extended her boarding pass and driver's license toward him. Danny took the documents but barely glanced at them before looking up at Maya with narrowed eyes. He studied her face for a long moment, then looked back down at the ID, then up again. Maya felt a familiar tension creep into her shoulders, a sensation she had experienced too many times in her 48 years. She kept her expression neutral and waited. Danny turned to his computer screen and began typing, his fingers moving slowly across the keyboard as if he was searching for something specific. Maya glanced at her watch. Boarding had already begun, and other passengers were flowing past them toward the jetway. But Danny held up a hand without looking at her, signaling her to wait. After what felt like several minutes but was probably only 40 seconds, Danny looked up again. His expression had hardened further. He asked Maya if this was really her identification. Maya responded calmly that yes, it was indeed her ID and that was her boarding pass as well. Danny shook his head slowly and said there was a problem with her credentials. He claimed that her name was flagged in the system and that she would need to provide additional documentation before she could board. Maya felt her heartbeat quicken, but she maintained her composure. She had learned long ago that showing frustration or anger in situations like this only made things worse. She asked Danny what kind of problem he was seeing and what additional documentation he needed. Danny did not answer her question directly. Instead, he asked her where she was coming from and what the purpose of her travel was. Maya explained that she was returning from vacation in Europe and was simply trying to get home to Atlanta. Danny asked if anyone could verify her identity. Maya paused, considering her options. She could easily call any number of people who would confirm who she was, but something about Danny's tone and demeanor told her that this was about more than verification. She told him that she was a frequent flyer with this airline and that her account should show years of travel history. Danny ignored this and asked to see her passport. Maya reached into her bag and produced her passport, which clearly showed her photo, name, and dozens of stamps from international travel. Danny examined it closely, holding it up to the light as if checking for forgery. He flipped through every page slowly while Maya stood there, increasingly aware that other passengers were beginning to notice the interaction. A middle-aged white woman in a business suit glanced over with curiosity. A young man with headphones around his neck slowed his walk to observe. Maya could feel their eyes on her, could sense their questions about why she was being detained. Danny finally handed back the passport but kept her driver's license and boarding pass. He said that he needed to verify something and that she should step aside and wait. Maya asked how long this would take since boarding was already in progress. Danny's voice took on an edge as he told her that she needed to be patient and cooperate with security procedures. Maya moved to the side as instructed but remained close enough to keep an eye on her documents. She watched as Danny picked up a phone and spoke quietly to someone, occasionally glancing in her direction. More passengers began to notice the situation. An elderly white couple stopped near Maya, and the husband asked quietly if everything was all right. Maya thanked him and said she was sure it would be resolved shortly, though she was far from sure of that. The wife frowned at Danny and whispered something to her husband. Near the gate desk, the gate agent, a young woman named Linda Morrison, watched the scene with growing concern. She had processed Maya's ticket earlier and had noticed the VIP notation next to her name in the system, though she had not understood its full significance. Linda wanted to say something but felt uncertain about contradicting a security officer. Danny hung up the phone and walked back to Maya with another officer following behind him. The second officer was Latino, shorter than Danny, with kinder eyes and a more measured presence. His name tag identified him as Carlos Mendez. Carlos asked Maya politely if he could ask her a few questions. Maya agreed, noting that Carlos at least seemed willing to treat her with basic respect. Carlos asked to see her boarding pass and ID again, which Danny had been holding. He reviewed them carefully on his tablet computer, his eyes scanning the screen with genuine attention to detail. After a moment, Carlos looked up at Danny with a slight frown, as if questioning why this passenger had been stopped at all. Danny stepped closer to Carlos and spoke in a low voice, but Maya could hear fragments of the conversation. Danny insisted that something was not right, that procedures had to be followed, that they could not be too careful these days. Carlos responded quietly that everything appeared to be in order, and that the passenger should be allowed to board. Danny's face flushed slightly and his voice rose just enough to carry across the gate area. He said that he was the primary officer on duty, and that he would make the determination about who could and could not board. He accused Carlos of not taking security seriously enough, and of being willing to cut corners. The conversation between the two officers was now clearly audible to everyone in the gate area. Boarding had slowed to a crawl as passengers paused to watch the confrontation. Some had pulled out their phones and were recording. A young Asian woman named Sophie Chang stood near the windows with her phone raised, capturing everything. She had witnessed the entire interaction from the beginning and had immediately recognized it for what it was. She was already composing a message to accompany the video, her fingers flying across her screen as she typed words like profiling and discrimination and unacceptable. Maya remained standing where Danny had told her to wait. Her carry-on bag sat at her feet. Her jacket was still zipped despite the warmth of the terminal. She kept her hands visible and her posture non-threatening, years of experience having taught her exactly how to navigate moments like these. But inside, anger was building alongside the familiar weariness that came from being judged by the color of her skin rather than the content of her character. She thought about her grandmother who had lived through segregation, who had told stories of being denied service at restaurants and prevented from voting. Maya had believed, perhaps naively, that those days were long past. Yet here she stood in 2025, being detained at an airport gate for no reason other than the bias of one security officer. Danny turned back to Maya and announced loudly that she would not be boarding this flight until the situation was fully resolved. He said that he had contacted airport police and that they would be arriving shortly to handle the matter. Maya felt the attention of the entire gate area focus on her completely now. She was no longer just another passenger having a problem. She had become a spectacle, a source of entertainment or concern or judgment depending on who was watching. And still she maintained her dignity, standing straight with her head high, waiting for whatever would come next. Carlos Mendez stood with his arms crossed, watching Danny Phillips with increasing concern. Carlos had been working airport security for 12 years, and he had seen his share of difficult situations. But something about this particular incident felt wrong from the beginning. He looked at Maya Richardson again, noting her calm demeanor, her quality clothing, and the way she carried herself with quiet confidence despite being publicly detained. Carlos had reviewed her credentials 3 times now on his tablet, and there was absolutely nothing irregular about them. Her boarding pass was legitimate, her identification was valid, and her name showed no flags whatsoever in any security database. He pulled Danny aside once more, keeping his voice low and professional. Carlos told Danny directly that there was no justification for continuing to detain this passenger. He pointed out that she had proper documentation, that she had passed through TSA security without incident, and that her travel history showed she was exactly who she claimed to be. Danny's jaw tightened and his eyes flashed with something Carlos recognized as wounded pride. Danny insisted that Carlos did not understand the full situation, that there were subtleties to security work that required experience and instinct. Carlos reminded Danny that he had 8 more years of experience than Danny did, and that his instinct was telling him they were making a serious mistake. Danny turned away from Carlos and walked back toward Maya, effectively ending the conversation. The gate area had become increasingly crowded as word of the confrontation spread. Passengers who had already boarded the aircraft were getting back off to see what was causing the delay. Others who were passing by on their way to different gates stopped to watch or record on their phones. The elderly couple who had asked Maya if she was all right now stood nearby, the husband speaking quietly but firmly to another passenger about what he had witnessed. He explained that he had seen the entire interaction from the beginning, that the officer had stopped this woman for no apparent reason, and that the situation had only escalated from there. His wife nodded in agreement and added that it was shameful to see someone treated this way. Sophie Chang had already posted her video to 3 different social media platforms with detailed captions explaining what was happening. She had a substantial following from her travel blog, and her posts were being shared rapidly. Within minutes, thousands of people were watching Maya Richardson being detained at Gate 47, and the comments were overwhelmingly critical of the security officer's actions. Sophie continued to record, making sure to capture everything that happened next. She had experienced her own share of discrimination while traveling, though never quite as blatantly as what she was witnessing now, and she was determined that this incident would not be swept under the rug or ignored. From the cockpit of the aircraft, Captain Gregory Hamilton had been informed of a delay due to a security issue at the gate. After 10 minutes passed with no resolution, he decided to come down and assess the situation himself. Gregory was a distinguished man in his 50s with graying temples and the kind of presence that commanded respect. He had been flying commercial aircraft for nearly 30 years and had seen the industry change in many ways, though not always for the better. He walked up the jetway and emerged into the gate area, immediately spotting the crowd that had gathered. When he pushed through to the center of the commotion, he saw Maya Richardson standing calmly while Danny Phillips appeared to be arguing with someone on his phone. Gregory recognized Maya immediately. He had met her several times at company events, though always in contexts where she was clearly identified as executive leadership. He had enormous respect for her, not just because of her position, but because she had personally intervened to create better working conditions and benefits for pilots and crew members. Gregory started to greet her by name, but caught the subtle shake of her head and the slight gesture she made with her hand. She was signaling him not to reveal her identity. Gregory understood immediately. She was letting this play out, though he could not imagine why she would subject herself to this treatment when a single word could end it. Still, he respected her choice and approached Danny instead. Gregory introduced himself as the captain of the aircraft and asked what the problem was. Danny looked at him with barely concealed irritation and said that there was a security issue that did not concern the flight crew. Gregory responded calmly that anything delaying his flight absolutely concerned him. He asked to see the passenger's documentation himself. Danny refused, stating that this was a security matter under his jurisdiction. Gregory's voice took on a harder edge as he informed Danny that he had ultimate authority over who boarded his aircraft, and that if there was a legitimate security concern, he needed to know about it. Danny insisted that he was following proper protocol, and that Gregory needed to return to the cockpit and let security handle the situation. The exchange between the captain and the security officer created another wave of murmuring through the crowd. Passengers were now openly taking sides, with the vast majority appearing to support Maya and questioning Danny's actions. A businessman in an expensive suit called out that this was ridiculous and that the passenger clearly had valid documentation. A young mother holding a toddler said loudly that she had been watching from the beginning and that the officer had stopped the woman for no reason. Danny's face flushed darker as he realized he was losing control of the situation. He raised his voice and demanded that everyone step back and stop interfering with security operations. Linda Morrison, the gate agent, finally found the courage to approach. She had been watching everything from her desk. Her stomach twisted in knots because she knew something was wrong but had been too afraid to speak up. She was only 26 years old and had been working for the airline for less than 2 years. She did not want to cause trouble or risk her job, but the situation had gone too far, and her conscience would not allow her to remain silent any longer. Linda walked up to Danny with her tablet in hand and told him that she had checked the passenger manifest multiple times and that this passenger had a special notation in the system. She tried to show him the screen, but Danny waved her away dismissively and told her to go back to her desk. Carlos Mendez made one more attempt to resolve the situation. He stepped directly in front of Danny and spoke in a voice that was quiet but firm. He told Danny that they needed to end this now, that they were creating an incident where none existed, and that there would be consequences if they continued down this path. Danny responded by telling Carlos that if he was not going to support proper security procedures, then perhaps he was in the wrong line of work. Carlos shook his head slowly, knowing that he had done everything he could. He stepped back but remained nearby, already thinking about the report he would need to file about this incident. Meanwhile, Sophie Chang's video had exploded across social media. It had been viewed over 500,000 times in just 20 minutes. Major news outlets were beginning to pick up the story, their social media teams recognizing the viral potential of the footage. Reporters were being dispatched to O'Hare Airport. The airline's corporate communications department was receiving urgent calls from journalists asking for comment. And in offices across the country, people were watching the video and sharing it with growing outrage. The hashtag that Sophie had created was trending nationally, with thousands of people sharing their own stories of discrimination and profiling while traveling. Danny's radio crackled with a call from airport police informing him that they were en route to Gate 47. Danny acknowledged the call and then turned to Maya with an expression of grim satisfaction. He told her that officers would be arriving shortly to handle her case. Maya's eyebrows rose slightly at the word case, as if she were somehow a criminal, rather than a passenger trying to board a flight. She asked Danny calmly what exactly she was being accused of. Danny responded that she was being uncooperative with security procedures and attempting to board an aircraft without proper verification. Maya pointed out that she had been nothing but cooperative and that she had provided every document he had requested. Danny ignored her and spoke into his radio again, asking for an estimated time of arrival for the police. Gregory Hamilton made a decision. He pulled out his phone and called the airline's operations center directly. He identified himself and explained that there was a serious situation developing at Gate 47 that required immediate attention from corporate leadership. The operations center supervisor asked what kind of situation, and Gregory chose his words carefully. He said that a passenger was being detained without cause by an airport security officer, and that the incident was being recorded and shared on social media. He added that the passenger in question was someone that corporate would definitely want to know about. The supervisor asked for the passenger's name, and Gregory spelled out Maya Richardson slowly and clearly. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, followed by a sudden flurry of urgent questions. Back in downtown Chicago, Peter Goldman was in his office reviewing quarterly financial reports when his assistant burst through the door without knocking. Sophie Chang watched her phone screen with a mixture of satisfaction and horror as the numbers climbed higher and higher. Her video had now been viewed more than 2 million times, and it was still accelerating. The comments section had become a flood of outrage, with people from all backgrounds expressing disgust at what they were witnessing. Many shared their own stories of being profiled at airports, creating a thread of collective pain and frustration that stretched for thousands of posts. Sophie had not expected this level of response, though she had hoped that shining a light on the incident would create some accountability. Now she was watching something much larger unfold, a moment that was touching a nerve in the national consciousness. News organizations were racing to cover the story. Assignment editors at CNN, NBC, ABC, and Fox News all made the same decision, within minutes of each other, to send crews to O'Hare Airport. Local Chicago stations had the advantage of proximity, and their vans were already pulling up to the terminal. Reporters checked their makeup in compact mirrors and rehearsed their opening lines while camera operators hauled equipment through the parking garage. The story had everything that made for compelling television: conflict, injustice, a sympathetic victim, and the promise of a dramatic resolution. None of them knew yet that the woman being detained was Maya Richardson, co-founder of the airline, which would make the story even bigger once that detail emerged. At the airline's corporate headquarters, Peter Goldman was moving with the kind of focused urgency that his staff had rarely seen. He barked orders to his assistant about who needed to be contacted and what needed to happen immediately. The head of security, Helen Foster, arrived at his office within minutes, having run up 4 flights of stairs rather than wait for an elevator. Helen was a former FBI agent who took her job seriously, and the thought that one of her officers was creating a national incident filled her with rage. Peter showed her the video, and Helen's expression darkened with each passing second. She pulled out her phone and began making calls to her team at the airport, demanding to know how this had happened and why she had not been informed sooner. Victoria Lee, the chief legal counsel, arrived moments later looking equally grim. She had already been on the phone with her litigation team, preparing for what she knew would be a public relations and legal nightmare. Victoria pointed out to Peter that they needed to be very careful about how they handled this situation. Any statement they made could be used in future lawsuits. Any action they took could be scrutinized and criticized, but at the same time, they could not afford to appear indifferent or slow to respond. Peter told her that he understood the legal concerns, but right now his only priority was getting to that airport and making sure Maya was treated with the respect and dignity she deserved. Victoria nodded and said she would come with him, already drafting talking points in her head. The three of them rode the elevator down to the parking garage in tense silence. Peter's driver was waiting with the engine running. Traffic in Chicago at this hour would normally be heavy, but Peter told his driver to take whatever route got them there fastest. The driver nodded and pulled out into the street, navigating aggressively through the downtown grid. In the back seat, Peter tried calling Maya's phone again, but it went straight to voicemail, just like the previous 5 times. He left another message, apologizing and begging her to call him back. Helen was on her phone coordinating with airport security management, trying to get a clear picture of what was happening on the ground. Victoria was reviewing the company's crisis communication protocols and making notes about potential legal exposure. In New York, the situation had reached the attention of Jacob Palmer. Jacob was the other co-founder of the airline, and he and Maya had built the company together from nothing more than a business plan and a shared dream. They had started with 3 leased aircraft 23 years ago, and now they operated over 200 planes and employed 15,000 people. Jacob was in a board meeting with potential investors when his executive assistant entered the conference room, something she would never do unless it was truly an emergency. She whispered in his ear, and Jacob's face transformed from polite attention to shocked concern. He excused himself from the meeting without explanation and followed his assistant out into the hallway. She handed him her tablet, and Jacob watched the video of Maya being detained. His hands began to shake slightly as anger surged through him. Maya was not just his business partner. She was his friend, someone who had been there through every challenge and triumph of building the airline. They had weathered financial crises, regulatory nightmares, and fierce competition together. And now she was being treated like a criminal at one of their own gates by someone who was supposed to represent their commitment to customer service. Jacob called his personal pilot and told him to prepare the company jet immediately. He was flying to Chicago, and he did not care what other appointments had to be canceled. Back at Gate 47, the situation had evolved into something resembling a protest. More than 100 people now crowded the gate area, far exceeding the number of passengers actually booked on the flight. Word had spread through the terminal, and people were coming to witness the spectacle or show their support for Maya. Some carried signs hastily made from notebook paper and marker pens with messages like, "Stop racial profiling and justice for all travelers." Airport security was becoming concerned about crowd control and had called for additional officers to manage the situation. But they were careful not to be too aggressive because everyone had cameras, and any misstep would be broadcast to millions. Danny Phillips was beginning to realize that things had spiraled far beyond his control. He had expected backup to arrive and validate his decision to detain the passenger. Instead, he found himself surrounded by hostile onlookers, contradicted by his fellow officer, questioned by the captain, and ignored by the gate agent. His radio kept crackling with messages from supervisors asking for status updates and telling him that corporate leadership was en route. Danny maintained his rigid posture and defensive attitude because he felt that backing down now would be admitting he had made a mistake, and his pride would not allow that. He told himself that he was just doing his job, that security procedures existed for a reason, and that everyone else was being too politically correct to support him. Lieutenant Karen White and Officer Troy Bennett of the airport police finally arrived at Gate 47. They had been briefed by Danny over the radio, but as they approached the scene, Both officers immediately sensed that something about the situation did not match the description they had been given. Karen was a 20-year veteran of law enforcement with sharp instincts for reading people and situations. She saw a well-dressed, calm woman standing with quiet dignity, while a security officer stood nearby looking flustered and defensive. She saw a crowd of diverse passengers who appeared to be supporting the detained woman, rather than fearing her. She saw multiple people recording on phones, which told her that this incident was already public, and that her handling of it would be scrutinized. Karen approached Maya first rather than Danny, which was her subtle way of indicating that she was going to make her own assessment. She introduced herself politely and asked Maya to explain what had happened. Maya recounted the events in a clear, measured voice, sticking to facts without embellishment or emotion. She explained that she had approached the gate with proper documentation, that Danny had stopped her without explaining why, that he had claimed there was a problem with her credentials despite multiple checks showing otherwise, and that the situation had escalated despite her cooperation and the intervention of others. Karen listened carefully, noting Maya's educated speech patterns, her expensive but understated clothing, and the way she maintained eye contact without hostility or fear. Karen then turned to Danny and asked him to explain his reasoning for detaining this passenger. Danny launched into an explanation about security protocols and system flags and the need for thorough verification. But as he spoke, his explanation became increasingly vague and circular. He could not point to any specific flag in any specific system. He could not articulate what additional verification he had been seeking. He could not explain why he had rejected the intervention of other airline personnel who had confirmed the passenger's credentials. Karen's expression remained neutral, but internally she was already concluding that this detention had no legitimate basis. Troy Bennett, Karen's partner, was interviewing witnesses in the crowd. The elderly couple described watching Danny single out Maya from the beginning without any apparent cause. Sophie Chang showed Troy her video footage, which clearly documented the entire interaction from start to finish. A businessman who had been standing nearby during the initial confrontation stated that he had heard Danny's questions and tone, and that they had seemed designed to intimidate rather than to verify. Each witness told essentially the same story, creating a consistent narrative that made Danny's actions appear increasingly indefensible. Christine Murray, a supervisor for the security contractor that employed Danny, finally arrived at the scene. She had been at a different terminal when the situation began. The gate area had transformed into something resembling a town hall meeting. Passengers who had been rebooked on other flights chose to stay, wanting to witness the resolution of an incident that had captured national attention. Airport personnel stood at the edges of the crowd, maintaining order but also clearly interested in how the situation would unfold. News crews had been allowed closer, their cameras capturing every moment as executives consulted in hushed conversations, and Maya sat with quiet dignity, occasionally speaking with passengers who approached her. The energy in the space was electric, a mixture of righteous anger, curiosity, and the sense that something historically significant was happening. Peter Goldman stood near Maya, his phone constantly buzzing with calls from board members, investors, government officials, and media outlets. He ignored most of them, knowing that any statement he made now would be scrutinized and dissected. Helen Foster was coordinating with her security team to ensure that proper procedures were being followed for the investigation. She had already pulled surveillance footage from multiple angles, interviewed witnesses, and begun documenting everything for what would certainly be a lengthy legal and regulatory review. Victoria Lee was drafting and redrafting statements, trying to find language that was honest and accountable without creating unnecessary legal exposure. Carlos Mendez approached Maya tentatively, his hat in his hands. He apologized for not doing more to stop what had happened, explaining that he had tried to intervene multiple times but had been overruled by Danny. Maya looked at him thoughtfully and then thanked him for his efforts. She told him that she had watched him try to do the right thing, and that his actions stood in stark contrast to Danny's. She asked for his name and made a note of it on her phone. Carlos did not know it yet, but that simple gesture would change the trajectory of his career in ways he could not imagine. Maya believed in recognizing people who showed moral courage, and she had plans for officers like Carlos. Sophie Chang was still recording, though her phone battery was running dangerously low. She had become something of a celebrity herself, with reporters asking to interview her about her decision to document the incident. Sophie explained that she had witnessed too many injustices that went unrecorded and unacknowledged, and she believed that visibility was the first step toward accountability. Her video had now been viewed over 10 million times, and the hashtag she had created was trending in multiple countries. Sophie had inadvertently sparked a global conversation about racial profiling and discrimination in travel, and she was receiving messages from people around the world sharing their own experiences. The elderly couple who had first asked Maya if she was all right introduced themselves as Harold and Betty Martinez. They explained that they were retired teachers who had spent their careers fighting for civil rights, and they could not stand by silently while witnessing discrimination. Harold said that he had been arrested in the 1960s for participating in sit-ins, and that seeing similar injustice in 2025 filled him with a familiar anger. Betty added that they had raised their children to speak up against injustice, and they were glad they had followed their own advice today. Maya embraced them both, moved by their solidarity and their history of activism. Kevin Harris, the teenage boy who had noticed the executive folder in Maya's belongings, approached nervously with his mother. He apologized for not speaking up more forcefully when he had realized something was wrong. His mother, Patricia, told Maya that she had taught Kevin to respect authority, but that this incident had shown both of them that sometimes authority was wrong and needed to be challenged. Maya spoke with Kevin directly, encouraging him to always trust his instincts about right and wrong, and to never let fear of consequences prevent him from standing up for justice. The conversation lasted several minutes, and Kevin left with a new understanding of how ordinary people could make a difference in extraordinary moments. Danny Phillips had left the airport, but his absence did not mean the focus on him had diminished. Reporters had identified him through airport sources and were already digging into his background. They discovered social media posts that suggested racial bias, comments on news articles that revealed problematic attitudes, and participation in online forums where discriminatory views were common. While none of this proved that his actions at the gate were racially motivated, it created a pattern that was deeply troubling. The security contractor that had employed him was now facing questions about their hiring and training practices, and whether they had missed warning signs that should have prevented Danny from working in a position of authority. Christine Murray was on the phone with her company's executives, trying to explain the catastrophe that had befallen them. The security contractor had built a reputation over 20 years of reliable service, and now that reputation was being destroyed in a matter of hours. Their largest clients were already calling to express concerns, and some were threatening to terminate contracts. Christine knew that her own job was likely in jeopardy, and she felt a bitter resentment toward Danny for putting her in this position, even as she recognized that the company's training and oversight had failed to prevent the incident. Lieutenant Karen White had completed her preliminary investigation and approached Victoria Lee with her findings. She explained that based on witness statements, video evidence, and a review of security protocols, Danny Phillips had violated multiple procedures and appeared to have detained Maya without reasonable suspicion. Karen was careful to note that determining whether the detention was racially motivated would require a more extensive investigation, but the evidence suggested that bias had played a role. Victoria thanked her for the thorough work and asked for a written report to be sent to the airline's legal department. Karen agreed and then quietly mentioned that she hoped the airline would use this incident to implement better training and oversight for all security personnel. Jacob Palmer's jet touched down at O'Hare and taxied to a private terminal. Jacob barely waited for the stairs to be lowered before descending rapidly. A car was waiting to take him to Terminal 3, and he urged the driver to hurry despite knowing that there were speed limits even on airport property. Jacob's mind was racing with thoughts of what he would say to Maya, how he would make this right, and what changes needed to be implemented immediately. He and Maya had always shared decision-making equally, but he felt a special responsibility because he knew that as a white man, he had never faced the kind of discrimination Maya experienced regularly. Back at the gate, Peter decided it was time to make a preliminary statement to the gathered media. He consulted briefly with Maya, who approved his plan to speak first and establish the basic facts before she decided whether to address the public herself. Peter walked toward the cameras with Helen and Victoria flanking him. their presence signaling that this was being taken seriously at the highest levels of the company. The reporters surged forward, shouting questions, but Peter raised his hands for quiet. Peter began by acknowledging that a serious incident had occurred, that a valued passenger had been detained without cause, and that the airline took full responsibility for the failure of procedures that had allowed this to happen. He announced that the security officer involved had been suspended and would face termination, that a full investigation was underway, and that the airline would be implementing comprehensive changes to security protocols and training. He did not name Maya specifically, respecting her privacy, but he made clear that the airline's leadership was personally involved in addressing the situation. Reporters immediately began shouting questions about whether the incident was racially motivated, whether there would be lawsuits, and whether the passenger's identity could be confirmed. Peter deflected most of these questions, stating that the investigation would address all relevant factors and that the passenger deserved privacy and respect. However, he did acknowledge that the airline took allegations of discrimination extremely seriously, and that if bias was found to be a factor, there would be severe consequences. His statement was measured and professional, hitting the right notes of accountability without making admissions that would create legal problems. As Peter finished speaking, Jacob Palmer arrived at the gate area. He moved through the crowd with purpose, ignoring the reporters trying to intercept him for comment. He saw Maya sitting near the windows and walked directly to her. The two embraced, a gesture that clearly communicated their close relationship and mutual respect. Jacob spoke quietly to Maya, asking if she was all right, and she assured him that she was fine physically but exhausted emotionally. Jacob's jaw tightened with anger at what she had endured, but he kept his emotions in check, knowing that Maya needed support rather than displays of fury. Peter, Helen, and Victoria joined Maya and Jacob, and the five of them moved to a quieter corner of the gate area for a private conversation. They discussed what had happened, what needed to happen next, and how to turn this crisis into an opportunity for meaningful change. Maya was clear about her expectations. She did not want this to be swept under the rug with empty apologies and minor policy adjustments. Peter Goldman's car weaved through Chicago traffic with an urgency that bordered on reckless. The driver had given up on following traffic laws strictly and was instead focused on getting them to O'Hare as quickly as possible without causing an accident. In the back seat, Peter stared at his phone screen, refreshing news sites and social media feeds every few seconds. Each refresh brought worse news. The video had now been viewed over 5 million times. Major news outlets were leading their coverage with the story. Congressional representatives were tweeting about it. Civil rights organizations were issuing statements demanding accountability. The airline's customer service lines were jammed with calls, both from angry customers threatening to boycott and from reporters seeking comment. Helen Foster sat beside Peter, her phone pressed to her ear as she worked to gather more information. She was speaking with the head of airport security operations, demanding answers about why this situation had been allowed to develop and why the chain of command had failed so completely. Her voice was tight with controlled fury as she explained that a passenger had been detained without cause for over an hour, while the world watched. She ordered that Danny Phillips be removed from the gate area immediately, and that any other officers who had failed to intervene appropriately be identified for disciplinary review. Helen had built her career on integrity and competence, and watching one officer destroy years of careful work filled her with a rage that she struggled to contain. Victoria Lee was typing rapidly on her laptop, balanced precariously on her knees as the car swayed and accelerated. She was drafting multiple versions of a public statement, each one calibrated to different possible outcomes. If Maya chose to press charges, they needed a statement that expressed support for her while not admitting liability. If she chose to handle it internally, they needed a statement that acknowledged the problem while preserving the company's reputation. Victoria's legal mind was also calculating the potential damages from lawsuits, both from Maya herself and from other passengers who might come forward claiming similar treatment. The numbers were staggering, potentially running into tens of millions of dollars. The car finally pulled up to the terminal entrance, and the three executives climbed out before the vehicle had fully stopped. They moved through the terminal at nearly a run, their expensive shoes clicking on the polished floor as startled travelers jumped out of their way. Security personnel saw them coming and cleared a path. Everyone in the terminal seemed to know that something major was happening. News crews were setting up in strategic locations, waiting for a statement or a dramatic development. Peter's face was flushed with exertion and stress as they approached the gate area, where the crowd had grown even larger than the reports had indicated. Jacob Palmer's jet was already in the air, racing west from New York toward Chicago. Jacob sat in the leather seat, his usual calm demeanor replaced by visible agitation. He had called Maya's number a dozen times with no answer. He had called Peter for updates, but the calls went straight to voicemail, suggesting that Peter was underground or in an area with poor reception. Jacob thought about all the times he and Maya had discussed the challenges of being a black woman in the aviation industry, an industry that was still predominantly white and male in its leadership ranks. Maya had faced countless microaggressions and subtle discrimination over the years, but she had always handled them with grace and used them as motivation to prove herself. But this was not subtle. This was blatant and public, and Jacob felt personally responsible because it had happened within the company they had built together. At Gate 47, Peter Goldman burst through the crowd with Helen and Victoria close behind. People recognized the urgency in their movements and parted to let them through. Peter's eyes scanned the scene frantically until he spotted Maya standing near the windows, still calm but clearly exhausted. He rushed toward her, calling her name, and the crowd suddenly went silent as they realized that something significant was about to happen. Peter reached Maya and immediately began apologizing, his words tumbling out in a rush. He told her how sorry he was that this should never have happened, that they would fix it immediately. Maya looked at him with an expression that was hard to read, a mixture of weariness and something else, perhaps disappointment or resignation. Danny Phillips watched this interaction with growing confusion. He saw a senior executive, someone he recognized from company communications, apologizing profusely to the passenger he had been detaining. He heard Peter address her as Ms. Richardson with a level of deference that suggested she was not just any passenger. Danny felt a cold sensation spreading through his chest as the pieces began to fall into place. He looked at Carlos, who was watching him with an expression that mixed pity with disgust. He looked at Christine, his supervisor, who had gone pale and was staring at her phone screen with horror. Danny pulled out his own phone and searched for Maya Richardson, and the results made his hand start to tremble. Helen Foster approached Danny with swift, decisive steps. Her face was set in an expression of barely controlled fury. She identified herself and informed Danny that he was suspended effective immediately pending a full investigation. She demanded his badge and radio. Danny started to protest to explain his reasoning, but Helen cut him off sharply. She told him that he had detained and humiliated one of the most important people in the company, that his actions had created a national incident, and that there would be serious consequences. She ordered him to leave the airport immediately and await further instructions. Danny looked around desperately for support but found none. Even Christine, his supervisor, would not meet his eyes. Victoria Lee had begun speaking with Lieutenant Karen White, trying to understand what the legal situation was and whether any charges would be filed. Karen explained that based on her investigation, there had been no legitimate reason for the detention and that the passenger had been completely cooperative throughout. She added that the incident appeared to be a case of profiling, though she was careful not to make that assessment official without further review. Victoria thanked her for her professionalism and asked her to provide a full report to the airline's legal department. Karen agreed, and then approached Maya to apologize on behalf of the airport police department for the time it had taken to resolve the situation. Peter was still talking to Maya, trying to explain how this had happened and what steps they would take to ensure it never happened again. Maya listened patiently but then held up a hand to stop him. She spoke quietly so that only Peter and a few people nearby could hear. She told him that this incident was not just about her. She said that what had happened to her happened to countless other travelers every day. People who did not have her position or resources to fight back. She said that if something positive did not come from this experience, then it would be a tragedy compounded. Peter nodded, understanding that Maya was not interested in personal apologies or compensation. She wanted systemic change, and she was going to use this incident as a catalyst to achieve it. The news crews had been kept at a distance by security, but they could see the interaction between Maya and the executives. Reporters were shouting questions, trying to get comments or reactions. Camera operators zoomed in, capturing footage that would be played on evening news broadcasts across the country. Social media continued to explode with commentary and analysis. People were digging into Danny Phillips's background, finding his social media accounts, examining his past behavior for patterns. The security contractor that employed him was receiving angry calls and threatening emails. Their reputation was being shredded in real time, and their stock price was dropping even faster than the airlines. Christine Murray approached Helen Foster and tried to explain what had happened from her perspective. She said that Danny had been a good officer with a clean record, that this was completely out of character, that there must have been some kind of misunderstanding. Helen listened, but her expression made clear that she was not interested in excuses. She told Christine that the security contract would be under review, and that significant changes would need to be made if they wanted to continue working with the airline. Christine nodded, knowing that her company's future was now in jeopardy because of one officer's actions and the failure of oversight that had allowed those actions to continue unchecked. Maya finally allowed herself to sit down in one of the gate area chairs. Her legs were shaking slightly from standing for so long, and she accepted a bottle of water that someone offered her. The crowd around her had shifted from observers to supporters, with many people approaching to express their solidarity or share their own stories. Maya listened to each person, making eye contact and acknowledging their experiences. She understood that she had become a symbol in this moment, and she took that responsibility seriously. She would not waste this opportunity to highlight injustice and demand change. Captain Gregory Hamilton approached the group of executives and formally introduced himself. He explained that he had witnessed much of the incident and would be filing a report with the FAA about security procedures that had endangered the safety and dignity of passengers. Maya Richardson stood before the cameras with the kind of presence that commanded attention without demanding it. The gate area had fallen completely silent, hundreds of people holding their phones up to record this moment, while news cameras broadcast it live to millions more watching at home and on their devices. Maya took a breath, composed her thoughts, and began to speak in a voice that was clear and steady despite the exhaustion she felt. She thanked everyone who had stood up for her during the incident, naming several people, specifically including Harold and Betty Martinez, Sophie Chang, Kevin Harris and his mother Patricia, Carlos Mendez and Captain Gregory Hamilton. She acknowledged that their courage in speaking up had made a difference, and that silence in the face of injustice only allows injustice to continue. She noted that many people had witnessed discrimination, but felt powerless to intervene, and she wanted them to know that even small acts of solidarity mattered enormously to those experiencing unfair treatment. Maya then addressed what had happened to her directly. She explained that she had been stopped without cause, questioned inappropriately, detained for over an hour, and subjected to treatment that no passenger should experience. She noted that she had remained calm and cooperative throughout, yet the situation had escalated anyway. She said that this incident was not unique, that countless travelers face similar treatment every day, and that the difference was simply that her position gave her a platform to demand accountability. She emphasized that the real tragedy was not what happened to her, but what happened to all the people who experienced discrimination without the resources or visibility to fight back. Then Maya revealed her identity. She stated clearly that she was Maya Richardson, co-founder and chief operating officer of the airline, and that she had built this company over 23 years with the vision of making air travel accessible and dignified for everyone. She explained that she had been traveling incognito to experience the airline as a regular passenger, wanting to understand the customer experience without the special treatment that executives typically received. She had discovered serious problems in that experience, problems that she took responsibility for not identifying and addressing sooner. The revelation sent a shockwave through the crowd. Reporters immediately began shouting questions, passengers gasped and whispered, and social media exploded with the new information. Sophie Chang's hand shook as she held her phone, realizing that the video she had posted documented a security officer detaining one of the most powerful people in the aviation industry. Harold and Betty Martinez looked at each other with wide eyes, understanding now why the corporate response had been so swift and intense. Kevin Harris grabbed his mother's arm in excitement, knowing that he had been right about the executive folder he had noticed earlier. Maya continued speaking, not allowing the reaction to derail her message. She announced that the airline would be implementing immediate and comprehensive changes to all security procedures. She explained that an independent oversight committee would be formed to review practices and ensure accountability. She promised that all employees would receive mandatory training on implicit bias and fair treatment. She stated that a passenger advocacy program would be established to give travelers a voice when they experienced problems. She committed to transparency in the investigation of this incident and in the implementation of reforms. Jacob Palmer stepped forward and added his voice to Maya's commitment. He explained that he and Maya had built the airline on principles of respect and dignity for all, and that this incident revealed they had failed to live up to those principles. He announced that the board of directors would be convening an emergency meeting to approve funding for the initiatives Maya had outlined. He stated that the security contractor involved would have their contract terminated immediately, and that all security arrangements would be reviewed and restructured. He promised that this incident would be a turning point for the airline and hopefully for the industry. The questions from reporters came rapid fire after the executives finished their statements. Maya and Jacob answered some directly while deflecting others that were too sensitive for public comment. They acknowledged that lawsuits were possible, but stated that their focus was on doing the right thing regardless of legal considerations. They confirmed that Danny Phillips had been terminated and would not work in aviation security again if they had any influence over it. They admitted that the incident had revealed systemic problems that required systemic solutions. They expressed gratitude to the passengers who had supported Maya and apologized to all travelers who had been delayed or inconvenienced by the situation. After nearly an hour of questions and answers, Maya and Jacob concluded the press conference. They thanked everyone for their attention and patience, and they asked the traveling public to hold them accountable for the promises they had made. As they stepped away from the cameras, the crowd erupted in applause. It started with a few people and quickly spread until hundreds were clapping, some cheering, some calling out words of encouragement and support. Maya was surprised by the response, moved by the solidarity that strangers were showing to someone they had only learned about hours earlier. Over the following days, the incident continued to dominate news coverage and social media conversation. Analysis pieces examined the prevalence of racial profiling in air travel, the challenges of managing security without discrimination, and the broader implications of systemic bias in public spaces. Civil rights leaders praised Maya for using her platform to highlight injustice and demand change. Business analysts debated whether the airline's response was sufficient or if more drastic measures were needed. Aviation experts discussed security protocols and where the balance should be struck between safety and fairness. The airline's stock price stabilized after the initial drop, with investors recognizing that the company's response had been appropriate and that leadership was taking the crisis seriously. Customer sentiment surveys showed a complex picture. Some travelers expressed anger and disappointment about what had happened, while others expressed appreciation for the transparency and commitment to reform. Booking patterns showed an initial decline followed by a recovery, particularly among Black travelers who saw the airline's response as genuine rather than performative. Danny Phillips became a national symbol of the kind of implicit bias that persists in American society. His termination was reported widely, along with details of his social media history and online activity that revealed troubling attitudes about race and authority. Danny himself gave one brief interview to a local television station, offering a vague apology and claiming that he had only been trying to do his job. The interview was widely criticized as inadequate and self-serving, and Danny soon stopped responding to media requests. The security contractor that had employed him lost multiple contracts and eventually restructured completely, implementing new hiring and training procedures in an attempt to salvage their reputation. Carlos Mendez was promoted to a leadership position within the airline's new security oversight division. His attempts to intervene during Maya's detention had been noted and appreciated, and Maya personally recruited him to help develop better protocols and training programs. Carlos accepted the position with a sense of purpose, knowing that he could help prevent future incidents if given the authority and resources to implement real change. He worked closely with civil rights organizations and law enforcement experts to create a model that other airlines and airports could adopt. Linda Morrison, the gate agent who had hesitated to intervene, was not fired, but was required to complete extensive additional training. She met with Maya personally to apologize and to explain her fear of speaking up against authority. Maya was understanding but firm, explaining that customer service personnel had a responsibility to advocate for passengers, and that remaining silent in the face of injustice made someone complicit in that injustice. Linda took the lesson to heart and became an outspoken advocate for passenger rights within the company, often speaking at training sessions about her experience and her regret about not acting sooner. Sophie Chang's video became one of the most watched pieces of citizen journalism in years. Major news organizations credited her with documenting an important moment in the ongoing struggle for civil rights and equality. Sophie was invited to speak at conferences and universities about the power of social media to hold institutions accountable. She eventually joined the airline's public relations department as an intern while completing her degree, bringing a fresh perspective on how companies should communicate with the public and respond to crises. Her presence in the corporate office was a constant reminder that ordinary people with phones could shine light on problems that had been hidden for too long. Harold and Betty Martinez became minor celebrities among social justice advocates. Their willingness to speak up despite their age and vulnerability resonated with people who felt that standing up against injustice required courage at any stage of life. They gave several interviews about their history of activism and their belief that the fight for civil rights was never truly finished. The impact of Maya Richardson's detention at Gate 47 rippled far beyond a single airline. Within weeks of the incident, other airlines found themselves facing increased scrutiny about their own security practices and treatment of minority passengers. Travelers who had previously accepted discriminatory treatment as an unfortunate reality of flying began sharing their stories publicly, emboldened by Maya's example. Social media platforms filled with accounts of passengers being singled out for additional screening, questioned aggressively about their travel plans, or subjected to humiliating searches based on nothing more than their appearance or ethnicity. The Department of Transportation launched a comprehensive investigation into discrimination in air travel. Federal investigators interviewed thousands of passengers, reviewed complaints that had been filed over the previous 5 years, and examined security footage from airports across the country. The findings were disturbing. Clear patterns emerged showing that passengers of color, particularly Black and Middle Eastern travelers, were disproportionately stopped for additional screening, even after passing through standard security checkpoints. Muslim women wearing hijabs reported being asked to remove their head coverings in public areas. Latino travelers described being questioned about their immigration status despite being American citizens. Asian travelers shared experiences of being treated as perpetual foreigners, regardless of how long their families had lived in the United States. Congress held hearings on the issue, with Maya Richardson invited to testify alongside other travelers who had experienced discrimination. The hearing room was packed with advocates, journalists, and concerned citizens who recognized that this was about more than air travel. It was about dignity, equality, and whether America was living up to its stated ideals. Maya spoke eloquently about her experience, but she made sure to emphasize that her story was not unique or even particularly severe compared to what many others had endured. She introduced the committee to several passengers who had been detained for hours, missed important family events, or experienced trauma from aggressive security interactions. Their testimonies were powerful and moving, and several committee members were visibly affected by what they heard. The Federal Aviation Administration issued new guidelines for security screening that explicitly prohibited profiling based on race, ethnicity, religion, or national origin. The guidelines required airlines and security contractors to document the reason for any additional screening, to provide passengers with information about complaint procedures, and to conduct regular audits of security practices to identify potential discrimination. Airlines that failed to comply would face significant fines and could lose their operating certificates. The guidelines were not perfect, and advocates argued that they did not go far enough, but they represented meaningful progress toward accountability. Other airlines scrambled to implement their own reforms, not wanting to face the kind of public relations disaster that had befallen their competitor. Some hired diversity consultants to review their practices and recommend changes. Others established passenger advisory councils to provide feedback on policies and procedures. A few took the dramatic step of terminating their relationships with security contractors who had poor records on discrimination issues. The competitive pressure to demonstrate commitment to fair treatment created a race to implement reforms, with each airline trying to position itself as a leader in passenger rights and dignity. The airline industry's largest trade association convened a summit on discrimination in air travel, inviting civil rights leaders, government officials, and airline executives to discuss solutions. Maya Richardson was a keynote speaker, and she used the platform to challenge her peers to do better. She acknowledged that her company had failed to prevent discrimination and that other airlines likely had similar problems. She called for industry-wide standards that would ensure consistent treatment across all carriers. She proposed a shared database of security personnel who had been terminated for discriminatory behavior, preventing them from simply moving to another company and continuing the same practices. Her speech received a standing ovation, though some executives privately grumbled that she was being too aggressive in her criticism of the industry. The incident also sparked broader conversations about systemic racism in America. Commentators noted that if someone as successful and powerful as Maya Richardson could be detained and humiliated because of her skin color, then the problem was deeper than individual bias. It revealed how assumptions about who belonged in certain spaces and who was suspicious persisted despite decades of civil rights progress. Universities added discussions of the incident to their curricula in courses on sociology, criminology, and business ethics. High school teachers used it as a case study to help students understand implicit bias and the importance of speaking up against injustice. Civil rights organizations used the momentum from the incident to push for broader reforms beyond air travel. They highlighted how racial profiling occurred in retail stores, banks, hospitals, and countless other settings where Black Americans and other minorities were treated with suspicion rather than respect. They organized campaigns to pressure companies to examine their own practices and implement meaningful changes. They provided training and resources to help individuals recognize and challenge discrimination when they witnessed it. The incident at Gate 47 became a rallying cry for a new generation of activists who refused to accept that discrimination was inevitable or unchangeable. Legal scholars debated the implications of the incident for civil rights law. Some argued that existing protections were inadequate and that new legislation was needed to address discrimination in private spaces like airports and commercial aircraft. Others maintained that current laws were sufficient if properly enforced, and that the problem was lack of will rather than lack of authority. Several lawsuits were filed by passengers who had experienced similar treatment, citing Maya's case as precedent. The litigation created pressure on airlines to settle cases rather than face public trials that could damage their reputations further. Maya's airline partnered with 3 major universities to conduct research on bias in security settings. The research examined how decisions were made about which passengers to subject to additional screening, whether those decisions could be made more objective, and what training methods were most effective at reducing discriminatory behavior. The findings were published in academic journals and shared widely within the industry. The research revealed that even well-intentioned security personnel often relied on unconscious biases when assessing potential threats, and that structured decision-making processes could significantly reduce discriminatory outcomes. The scholarship fund that Maya established for aspiring aviation professionals from underrepresented communities received overwhelming support. Donations poured in from individuals, foundations, and corporations who wanted to be associated with positive change. The fund provided full tuition, mentorship, and internship opportunities for students pursuing careers as pilots, mechanics, air traffic controllers, and aviation executives. The first class of scholarship recipients included 20 students from diverse backgrounds, and their stories were featured in marketing materials that showed the airline's commitment to creating a more inclusive industry. Maya worked closely with historically Black colleges and universities to create pipeline programs that would introduce students to aviation careers. She visited campuses personally to speak with students about opportunities in the industry and to encourage them to consider paths they might not have thought were available to them. She shared her own story of growing up in a working-class neighborhood and never imagining that she would one day co-found an airline. She emphasized that representation mattered, that seeing people who looked like them in positions of leadership made success feel possible. For the next generation, The incident prompted several prominent Black pilots and aviation professionals to form an organization dedicated to increasing diversity in the industry. They created mentorship programs, hosted career fairs at schools and minority communities, and lobbied for policies that would make aviation careers more accessible. Maya served on the organization's board and provided substantial financial support. She recognized that changing the culture of aviation required not just punishing discrimination when it occurred, but actively creating opportunities for people who had historically been excluded from the industry. Other industries began to take notice of what was happening in aviation. Retail companies examined their policies on shoplifting prevention and whether their security personnel were disproportionately following and detaining minority customers. Banks reviewed their practices for reporting suspicious transactions and whether those reports reflected racial bias rather than actual evidence of illegal activity. Hotels and restaurants looked at how they treated guests and whether Black customers were receiving the same service and respect as white customers. The conversation about discrimination that Maya's incident had sparked was spreading beyond air travel and forcing organizations across sectors to confront uncomfortable truths about their practices. Maya Richardson sat in her corner office overlooking downtown Chicago on a gray November afternoon, exactly 6 months after the incident at Gate 47. The city stretched out before her, and she could see planes taking off and landing at O'Hare in the distance, tiny specks against the cloudy sky. She had been asked to participate in a documentary about discrimination in travel, and a film crew was setting up cameras and lights in her office. Maya had initially resisted the idea of revisiting the experience, wanting to move forward rather than dwelling on what had happened. But she had come to understand that her story was not just about her, and that sharing it might help others who faced similar challenges. The interviewer, a thoughtful woman named Rachel, who had produced several acclaimed documentaries about social justice issues, began with gentle questions about Maya's background and her path to becoming an airline executive. Maya spoke about growing up in Atlanta, the daughter of a postal worker and a nurse, neither of whom had attended college but both of whom had insisted their children would. She described her fascination with airplanes as a child, watching them fly overhead and dreaming about where they were going and who was on board. She explained how she had studied business and finance in college, worked her way up through various companies, and eventually met Jacob Palmer at an aviation conference where they discovered a shared vision for a different kind of airline. Rachel then asked Maya to describe what happened at Gate 47. Maya took a breath and walked through the events in careful detail, trying to convey not just what happened but how it felt. She explained the familiar tension that crept into her shoulders when Danny Phillips looked at her with suspicion. She described the calculation she went through about how to respond, knowing that showing anger or frustration would likely make things worse. She talked about the surreal experience of being publicly humiliated while maintaining a facade of calm, and how exhausting it was to constantly perform dignity in the face of injustice. She noted that despite her success and position, she still faced the same prejudices as any other Black woman in America, and that no amount of achievement could fully insulate her from discrimination. Rachel asked whether Maya regretted not revealing her identity immediately, which would have ended the situation quickly. Maya considered the question seriously before responding. She explained that in the moment, she had wanted to see how the situation would be handled without the weight of her position influencing the outcome. She had wanted to understand what ordinary passengers experienced when they faced similar treatment. She acknowledged that the decision had cost her an hour of humiliation and had created a crisis for the company, but she maintained that it had also revealed problems that needed to be addressed. If she had immediately identified herself as an executive, those problems would have remained hidden and unresolved. The conversation turned to the changes that had been implemented since the incident. Maya described the comprehensive review of security procedures, the bias training that all employees had completed, and the oversight mechanisms that had been established. She talked about the scholarship fund and the pipeline programs designed to increase diversity in aviation careers. She explained the passenger advocacy program that gave travelers a voice when they experienced unfair treatment. Rachel asked whether Maya believed these changes were sufficient or whether they were merely symbolic gestures designed to manage public relations. Maya responded that the question was fair and that only time would truly tell whether the reforms were meaningful or superficial. But she emphasized that the airline had invested significant resources and that leadership was genuinely committed to creating lasting change rather than simply waiting for the controversy to fade. Jacob Palmer visited Maya's office after the interview concluded. He brought coffee and pastries from the bakery they both loved, a small gesture of care and friendship. They sat in the comfortable chairs by the window and talked about everything except work for a while, discussing books they had read and shows they had watched and plans for the upcoming holidays. Eventually, the conversation turned to the transformation their airline had undergone over the past 6 months. Jacob expressed both pride in what they had accomplished and frustration that it had taken a crisis to motivate the changes. He wondered aloud why they had not been more proactive about examining their practices before something terrible happened. Maya reminded him that they were human and imperfect, that they had blind spots like everyone else, and that the important thing was how they responded when problems were revealed. She noted that many companies faced similar crises and responded with denial, defensiveness, and minimal changes designed to appease critics without addressing root causes. Their airline had chosen a different path, embracing transparency and implementing substantive reforms even though it was difficult and expensive. Jacob acknowledged her point but still felt the weight of responsibility for not creating a culture that would have prevented the incident in the first place. Maya reached over and squeezed his hand, a gesture of solidarity and shared burden. They discussed the airline's financial performance, which had recovered from the initial stock drop and was now stronger than before the incident. Customer loyalty had increased, particularly among minority travelers who appreciated the company's response and commitment to fair treatment. Employee morale had improved as workers felt proud to be part of an organization that took justice seriously. New business partnerships had formed with companies that wanted to align themselves with the airline's values. The incident had been painful and embarrassing, but it had also created opportunities for growth and positive change that might not have emerged otherwise. Maya received a letter in her office mail that afternoon, forwarded from the Corporate Communications Department. The return address showed Danny Phillips's name, and Maya hesitated before opening it. She had not heard from Danny since his termination, though she had occasionally read news articles about his struggles to find employment after becoming nationally known for the incident. Maya opened the envelope carefully and read the handwritten letter inside. Danny apologized for his actions, acknowledging that he had treated her unfairly and that his behavior had been influenced by unconscious biases he had not recognized or addressed. He explained that he had been in counseling and had come to understand how prejudice had shaped his perceptions and decisions. He did not ask for forgiveness or for help finding a new job. He simply wanted her to know that he was working to become a better person. Maya read the letter twice, searching for signs of sincerity or manipulation. She ultimately decided that Danny's motivation did not matter as much as whether he was genuinely changing his behavior and attitudes. She did not respond to the letter, but she kept it in a drawer in her desk, a reminder that people were capable of growth even after causing harm. She hoped that Danny's transformation was real, and that he would use his experience to help others recognize and confront their own biases. But she also knew that apologies did not erase damage and that Danny would live with the consequences of his actions regardless of how much he had learned from them. The airline established the Maya Richardson Award for Moral Courage, and the first ceremony was held at the company's annual meeting, 6 months after the incident. The event was attended by thousands of employees along with board members, investors, and media representatives. Maya stood on stage and explained the purpose of the award, emphasizing that it was meant to recognize employees who demonstrated exceptional commitment to treating passengers and colleagues with fairness and respect. She announced that Carlos Mendez had been selected as the first recipient, and Carlos walked to the stage looking both proud and humble. Maya embraced Carlos and then invited him to speak. Carlos thanked the company for recognizing his efforts, but emphasized that he had only done what anyone should do when witnessing injustice. He talked about his years working in airport security, and the countless times he had seen colleagues make decisions based on bias rather than evidence. He explained that changing the culture required individuals to speak up even when it was uncomfortable or unpopular. He challenged everyone in the audience to think about times when they had remained silent in the face of unfairness, and to commit to doing better in the future. His speech was powerful and authentic, and he received a long-standing ovation from the assembled employees. Sophie Chang graduated from college that spring and accepted a full-time position in the airline's communications department. Her role focused on social media strategy and crisis management, areas where her experience documenting Maya's detention gave her unique insights. Sophie worked to help the airline build authentic relationships with customers and to respond to concerns with transparency rather than defensiveness. She pushed her colleagues to listen to criticism rather than dismissing it, and to recognize that social media had fundamentally changed the relationship between corporations and the public. Her fresh perspective and willingness to challenge conventional wisdom made her a valuable member of the team. Captain Gregory Hamilton became a trainer and mentor for pilots throughout the airline.